Your book, if I may generalize, is around 2012 when social media apps, particularly Instagram and Snapchat and some of these others, suddenly became ubiquitous, and young people were downloading and utilizing these things with abandon because none of the parents and very few of us had a strong sense of what the ultimate outcome was going to be. And you began to notice late 2000 and teens that there seemed to be a massive uptick, not just amongst your own students, but generalizably more depression, more anxiety, more suicide. You came to the conclusion and have now concluded in this book, The Anxious Generation, that it's not correlative, it's causative.
Yep.
And that this is true not just in the United States, but in Europe. You've sort of normalized for, you can't just say this is a cultural thing. You can't just say it's the Great Recession. And that converges with a parenting trend of the past 20 years, which is overprotective, helicoptery, over-present. And the result is to create coddled kids who are then denied a physical-based childhood, play and talk and et cetera, thrust into essentially a virtual childhood where all the social interactions or the predominance of social interactions are through these apps and media.
You got it. That's a very good summary of what the book argues.
No notes. That's a good grade.
Thank you all for listening today. I hope you got
We're
the book.
I'm going to zoom in on, what Zachary said about, you shunting aside the counter arguments that this is correlative and not causative. And I would like to dive deeper into that, because how do we know that it's social media, not like any number of other factors that have gone on these days?
Sure. Well, so first of all, I entered this debate heavily in 2019. I mentioned it in the Coddling the American Mind, which Greg Lukianoff and I wrote in 2017 into 2018. So we mentioned this possibility in the book that basically social media and smartphones are what caused students who arrived on campus around 2014, 2015 were very different from students before. They were much more fragile. They were much more easily harmed by words, even words that were not directed at them. So something was very different. And we thought at the time those were millennials. We all thought that students were millennials. But now we understand that Gen Z, there was a real change. If you were born after 1995, you're just substantially different psychologically. On average, of course, there's many exceptions, but you're different than, say, an older sister who is 3 years older, who is a millennial. At first, we didn't know what was causing it, and a lot of the evidence was just correlational. All along, there have been studies that heavy users of social media are more mentally ill than those that are not. And then people say, oh, well, that's reverse correlation. Maybe it's just that anxious people spend a lot of time. They're more likely to seek out social media. And that could be. And if all we had was correlational data, then we'd say, gosh, we just don't know. And then we would try to track down, well, what are the alternatives? And I've tried to track down all the alternatives, and none of them can explain why it happened at the same time in the same way in so many countries, right around 2012, 2013. So we'll come back to that. But your question was about causation. In the social sciences, our bread and butter is, how do we look out at a messy world composed of people, not composed of planets or rocks or things that sit there and let you study them, but composed of people who are complicated and they co-create meanings and cultures and interpretation. Social science is much harder than rocket science. Rocket science, you can calculate exactly, where you want the rocket to go, but social science is much harder. And the central question for us is causality. How do we know that X causes Y? And in the social world, you rarely have X causes Y, end of story. It's always multiple causation. But sometimes there is one big one. For example, leaded gas. When leaded gas was heavily used, it caused brain damage and it caused a drop in IQ and a rise in crime. I mean, lead poisoning was, especially in the United States, one big factor that had many, many neurological and developmental effects. The evidence that I've been collecting, and I've been collecting a lot of studies, people accuse me of cherry picking, but I'm the only one who picks all the cherries from the tree. I say, let's find all the studies on every side. Let's find all the correlational studies, the longitudinal studies, the experimental studies, the quasi-experimental studies. Let's find the direct testimony. What do kids say when you survey them? So I've collected all of these in giant Google Docs. I've then summarized them in multiple Substack posts. And so it's a little irritating that there are 3 or 4 major critics. They keep saying, I have no evidence. And and they keep saying, I don't know the difference between correlation and causation. I'm mistaking correlation for causation. So it's just kind of irritating because it's like, as though they haven't read my book or my work. In the book, I have a whole long section on the difference between causation and correlation, how we know that it's causation. I have so many Substack posts. So, my critics, it's fine if they want to say, okay, he presents a lot of evidence for causation, but we're not persuaded, and here's why. That would be a normal, fine scientific debate. But for them to repeatedly say that I don't have any evidence is just untrue. It's a falsehood that keeps being spread around. And then journalists sometimes repeat it. And it's frustrating because I don't know what else I can do. Jump up and down and say, here, look at these 5 websites. I've been laying out the evidence since 2019.
For anyone who's read the book, and I've certainly read most of it, if not all of it, that you are totally legit in saying that you have provided substantial statistical quantitative evidence of causation. I think the cross-cultural stuff is very powerful in particular, right? Because it filters out this is just Americans being discontent or et cetera. So let us stipulate for the purposes of this conversation that the evidence of causation is fairly substantial in the book. I'd like to maybe widen the aperture for a moment and maybe pick up some of what another Progress Network member, Tyler Cowan, and you had, I think, a conversation on.
Oh, yeah, that was a fun conversation.
If you had looked at responses to new technologies, printing press, telegraph, telephone, radio, television, early years of the internet, social media, and now AI, let's just say, throw that in there, and you took out the specificity of each one of those innovations, you have an extraordinarily similar set of mantras about the rise of new technologies. This is ruin, and a lot of it focuses on the young.
That's right. Yes, Socrates thought that writing would ruin their memories. Yes, no, that's right. The response is very, very similar across the ages. That's true.
So what do you make of that, first of all?
Yeah.
As a kind of a stepping back from the moment.
Yeah, no, so I acknowledge that this looks like a moral panic. And actually, it is a moral panic in that I'm saying something very serious is happening. So the question is it a groundless moral panic, like some of the ones you mentioned? Or is it actually a terrible thing that's happening? And Jean Twenge was one of the first to ring the alarm. Jean Twenge and I, are we alarm ringers or are we alarmists? And I grant that, and most of my critics are people who have been studying technology for a while. And so they say, oh, we've seen this before with violent video games. We've seen this before with comic books. So that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. And then it's up to me to show that, no, this time actually is different. And here are just 2 of the differences. One major, major difference is that the dynamics of past moral panics is very dependent on sensationalist news media accounts. So a kid read a comic book and then he axe murdered his mother. And maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. Probably it never happened. But the story gets spread around and people say, oh my God, we've got to ban comic books. That's not what's happening this time. This time, everyone has seen it. Everyone has seen it. If not in their own children, they've seen it in the children of someone they know. Daughters who are self-harming, boys and girls who are suicidal, a fragility of the anxiety. So when journalists interview me, they usually say, I've seen this in my own kids. So this is very unlike previous moral panics. This is not dependent on sensationalist news stories. Second, in all previous moral panics, if the grown-ups are saying, oh, comic books, they're destroying the kids are like, no, leave us alone. We don't want you to take our comic books. But Gen Z, when you ask the question, if you say, how about if I take you off social media? They say, no, I can't go off social media because I'll be dead. Because their whole social life is now on social media. So they're terrified of being basically ostracized and put into Siberia, which is what happens if you take a child's phone away. They sometimes commit suicide, or at least they're at elevated risk of committing suicide because the parents don't understand you've now given them social death. But whenever you phrase the question to them, how about if everybody got off? So in one study that was done at the University of Chicago last fall, one of the questions to college students was, would you prefer that Instagram and TikTok were never invented? And the majority, and for TikTok, it was even the majority of regular users of TikTok, so 58%, said, I would rather that this was never invented. Over and over again, we find young people are saying, this is destroying our generation. This is ruining. This is making us anxious. You didn't find that with any of the previous moral panics. You didn't find young women in the 18th century saying, oh, please take away the novels. It's making me sexually desirous. Like, this is really, really different.